Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Rozier. I'm the director of the Albert LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and a member of the Villanova History Department faculty. A special welcome to our distinguished panelists, Tom Zeiler, Sayuri Guthrie Shamuzu, and Daniel Gilbert, who will explore the topic of baseball, America, and the world. If baseball is America's game, then the game itself can tell us a lot about America. Jackie Robinson, Roberto Clemente, and the color line. Curt Flood and labor relations, Native American mascots and team names, and baseball and soft power as it engaged the world after the Civil War, one of tonight's themes. Before we begin, I want to thank Kevin Fox and Alvin Wong for helping to organize tonight's event. And I want to encourage you to attend the LePage Center's upcoming events. Our next lunch at LePage will be tomorrow at 12 p.m. in St. Augustine Center 410. Our undergraduate fellow, Cole Shoring, will discuss the media's role in the 1898 Wilmington race riots. And then the following week, Wednesday, March 27th, also at 12 noon in St. Augustine Center 410, Dr. Joseph Lennon, Associate Dean for International and Interdisciplinary Initiatives in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, will talk about the 1909 hunger strike of Marion Wallace Dunlop. Please visit the LePage Center website for further information about these events and others in April, including our final Cities in Historical Perspective event, which will take place in Chinatown, and a conversation with historian Adam Rome on the origins of Earth Day. And now I'd like to turn the program over to my History Department colleague, Dr. Marc Gallicchio, who will introduce our panelists and then moderate the discussion that will follow their presentations. Feel free to pose a question at any point via the Q&A feature. Dr. Gallicchio is the Mary M. Birle Chair in American History at Villanova, a specialist in 20th century American foreign relations and political history. He is the author of award-winning journal articles, 4 books, and the co-author of Implacable Foes, War in the Pacific, 1944 to 1945, which won the prestigious Bancroft Prize in 2018. He is currently working on a history of the Japanese-American descendants of Benjamin Franklin. In addition to being an award-winning scholar, Dr. Gallicchio plays first base and pitcher in a baseball league every spring and summer, striking out opponents with his curveball, slider, and fastball. Welcome, Dr. Gallicchio.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everybody. Professional sports today are a global phenomenon. In 2023, a total of 269 internationally born players representing 19 countries or territories outside of the 50 United States were on opening day rosters. That's 28.5% of the total number of players on opening day rosters, which is higher than the NBA. Which surprised me at least. The transnational scope of professional baseball and its place in international relations is one of the themes of tonight's event. The economic dimensions of that globalization, including its influence on labor relations, is another. As fans know, baseball is the only sport where the defense possesses the ball and the players wear see-through pants. I'm, of course, referring to Major League Baseball's current uniform fiasco, which, as funny as it is, the players' nearly uniform criticism of their new uniforms is also a reminder of the players' historic mistrust of the owners. The league says the uniforms are made with the same material as last year, and the players aren't buying it. Philadelphia Phillies outfielder Nick Castellanos recently complained that, quote, "We know when we're being lied to. Just saying straight up, just say straight up, listen, we wanted to save some money here. This is how much we're saving with this quality of uniform. An old uniform and the old stitching cost us this much, and we're saving this amount of money." And then our conversation would be, okay, if you're saving that much money, where are you putting it into the game? That mistrust of management and the economics of globalization have converged in a current disagreement between players and owners over the implementation of an international draft. Simply put, the players oppose the draft and the owners have been pushing for one for over a decade. The heart of the dispute is the age-old battle over the owner's desire to exercise control over players and the union's equally strong commitment to maintaining player options and maximizing salaries, in this case, for players born outside of the United States. To help us sort through this and other aspects of baseball's international history, we have three widely recognized experts who are also fans of the game. Batting leadoff tonight is Tom Zeiler. Tom is a professor of history at the University of Colorado, where he focuses on the history of U.S. foreign relations with interest in economics, globalization, and sports. He's the author of Ambassadors in Pinstripes, The Spalding World Baseball Tour, and the Birth of American Empire. He's also written Jackie Robinson and Race in America, and is co-author of National Pastime, U.S. History Through Baseball. Tom will be followed by Sayuri Guthrie-Shimizu. Sayuri holds the Dunleavy Family Chair in History at Rice University. She's the author of Trans-Pacific Field of Dreams, How Baseball Linked the United States and Japan in Peace and War. And she's the co-author of the Olympic Games as a Political Prism, Asia Rising. And she's also written articles on sports and American history, including one on baseball and U.S.-Asian relations. Our third presenter is Dan Gilbert from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dan specializes in U.S. labor and cultural history. His current research interests include the history of public employee unionism and the role of sports in the American workplace. Dan is the author of Expanding the Strike Zone, Baseball in the Age of Free Agency, which won the Sabre Baseball Research Award from the Society for American Baseball Research, which is what Sabre stands for. He has also published numerous articles on college and professional sports. So the format for tonight, as Paul Rozier mentioned, is each presenter will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn to the Q&A part of the program. So Tom, you're up.
I thank you, Mark. And before I start, I'd just like to thank the LePage Center and the director, Paul Rozier, and the center administrator, Kevin Fox, who's just instrumental to getting us all together, and Alvin, and certainly Mark, an old friend, not old, but we've known each other seemingly forever, both at conferences and of course over the phone. I've never seen him play. Apparently he does pitch well, so I'll leave that. I don't know if that's just a Phillies myth as an Atlanta Braves fan, or that's true. But thank you for having me, and our panelists. Sayuri, I've of course known forever, and Dan too. I've known your work, so it's just an honor to be on this panel. Mark mentioned some of the stats for baseball internationally. And I'm going to talk about globalization. Let me share the screen here. Hopefully this works. Hopefully you can see that. Start that. You okay there? We'll see that. As you mentioned, I've written on the Spalding World Tour, and I'd like to put this in the context of globalization. As I mentioned, as Mark said, there have been literally hundreds of foreign-born athletes in Major League Baseball. It's totaling about, as of last year, about 28% of the league, out of about 950 players total. About 270 or so are foreign born, and of course that certainly far surpasses what is truly our national pastime, football, which has about 8. Most of those are from Nigeria. Foreign, but the NBA, which doesn't have as many, but has more coverage, about 40 countries too. So baseball has been very impressive in globalizing or internationalizing, and you could make an argument that quite frankly has saved the sport. This is a sport that was headed really downhill from the 70s onward with disco nights and things like that just didn't fly that well. And built new stadiums, probably saved a lot of baseball after the strike of 94, 95, but it was certainly this globalization of the game too. And As of last year, baseball's revenue is about well over $11.5 billion. And so it's it's healthy, not as big as football, American football, but it certainly has survived whatever crisis it's been in. And as you know, you fans out there, you know that it has adjusted to the game, trying to speed up the game and things like that. That has been controversial to purists, but whatever. It seems to have hopefully attracted some young fans. Globalization then was a key to this. And what is globalization? Because we've thrown out the term for decades now. It really is, of course, the integration of markets, an economic phenomenon that is fueled by technology, communications, transportation. Of course, in more recent times, in the last 40 years or so, it's been the internet, information age, as we called it, that has fueled globalization. But back in the 19th century, late 19th century, up to World War I, there was another era of globalization. It was not as fast as today's, obviously, and smaller in scope, and perhaps more Anglo-American than truly global, but it still had that technological push to it. It still relied to an extent on free trade and capital investments too. And out of that era, in that era of the mid and late 19th century, baseball had emerged as the national pastime. Today, of course, I mentioned it's not. But it's hard to argue against the fact that baseball has become, in one of the key definitions of globalization, a unified global market. It is centered in the United States for sure. There are other leagues in other countries, the Japan League in Japan, namely, but it has globalization's processes really focus on a unified market too, and you really have that, in a way, a monopoly of most of our professional sports, baseball included. I have up here on a screen, I'll move through this, the Spalding World Baseball Tour, because this was the first stab at trying to seriously market baseball around the world, led by Albert Spalding. You'll see the tour here on your right, where they went. They were going to go to India. They didn't make it there. And then they cut through the Suez Canal and into Europe. But it was as global in scope as it could be, led by the first monopolist and the first difficult owner, certainly, or there had been a lot of difficult owners, but certainly the one of major magnitude in Albert Spalding. You'll recognize him in the sporting goods, which was his main interest here. And he came up with this idea not only to market sporting goods around the world. He had cornered the market, for example, in baseball. We used Spalding baseballs until 1975, roughly about 100 years, when the National League started in 1876. He cornered the market on uniforms, on gloves and bases and everything. He thought he could sell overseas by marketing baseball as possibly a global sport, marketing it especially against the British and cricket. He was part of a movement to try to show that baseball had wholly American roots. If you go to Cooperstown, that is a Doubleday field, but it's all a myth. That's all a myth. But he wanted to compete against cricket. And that's why he ended his tour in Britain. Here he is pictured with his team, with his Chicago White Stockings that he owned. And below he was a star pitcher for Boston and then Chicago. And this is him in his elder years at the turn of the century, too. He was a magnate. He was a monopolist. He was a key to baseball really growing, and what he wanted to do was stabilize it and make big profits from it. So he was behind a lot of innovation in baseball, and certainly labor restrictions on the ability of players to move, on limiting their salaries under what was called the reserve clause. I'm sure Dan will touch on too. This world tour started in Chicago. Actually, it went to Washington, D.C. first, where he got an audience with President Grover Cleveland, who was a fan of baseball. and wouldn't endorse the tour. But then the tour took off from Chicago and across the American West, played here in Denver, played through Minnesota before that, and ended up in San Francisco, where the tour embarked for its first big stop in Hawaii. And this was thanks to steamships and faster travel. And the tour met with the King and Queen of Hawaii. In my book, I deal a lot with, we don't have time for it, maybe later, about of race and racism and how these white tourists, as they were called, met up with some of the natives on what they saw of Hawaii. And Hawaii, at this time in 1888 into 1889, was not a state, of course, not till 1959. And there had been an attempt to try to bring Hawaii into the fold by business leaders. And so this tour stopping in Hawaii is also key to making baseball, kind of injecting baseball in as a business too, as you would fruit, pineapples or whatever else. And this is just some of the images from that tour. Most famously, these are the most famous images of the tour. Stopped in Egypt, where they had trouble playing ball game. This picture up top is actually from the 1913-1914 tour. They had problems playing because the audience, the spectators, kind of kept running onto the field, stealing the ball or taking the ball and trying to sell it back. But here are the tourists on the left and the pharaoh, the Sphinx, excuse me, and posing here all the way up through Egypt, and then through the Suez Canal into Italy. Their first stop, where they were disappointed of not getting an audience with the Pope, but played through Italy. Here's them at the Colosseum in Rome, but trying to market this game. And ending up in Britain. By the way, they stopped in France, played in Paris, 1889, before a half-built Eiffel Tower, which was part of the Paris Exposition later that year. And of course, this was only 3 years before after the French had sent the Statue of Liberty to the United States too. Here they were in Britain, played before the future King Edward VII, the Prince of Wales. The British were very unimpressed by this game, and the tour continued on, went back to New York City, where they were feted at Delmonico, which was the major place, or major restaurant there. Mark Twain was there, Teddy Roosevelt, ended up meeting Benjamin Harrison, next president, who was very unimpressed with them, and then ended up back in Chicago. This tour also gave rise to baseball in Australia. It gave rise to other tours. Here are some others. There were Negro League tours. There were a lot of tours to Japan. And there was this Giants White Sox tour in Asia and Europe in 1913. Perhaps most notable of that, Don McGraw and Comiskey kind of started this one. But notable of that is that was the first one to go to China, the Philippines, and Japan, which the earlier tour had missed. And most notably, perhaps, they sailed back to the United States on the Lusitania, which the next year, of course, was sunk by the Germans. I'm going to leave it at that because I have a lot of questions I'm sure you might have about globalization. Just wanted to give you an outline of this tour. I'll hand it over to Sayuri, who I'm sure is going to talk about perhaps maybe the most famous tour of all time with Babe Ruth. Thank you. Stops. All right. I think I've stopped sharing, right?
I think you did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sayuri, you're up. Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry that I was. I assumed that I was waiting to be invited to speak, but
Oh,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about this. And thank you, Mark, and Paul Roger, for inviting me to this panel. And it's such an honor for me to be on this panel with Dan and Tom, very renowned baseball historians. And also, I'd like to thank Kevin Fox for taking care of the logistics of this panel. So let's see, I can share a screen. Can I share this? Is it being shared or not? No? Is it shared? Is it? Do you see the Shohei Ohtani? You do. Okay. Well, so today I'm going to talk about the United States baseball, America baseball, and Japan. And any talk about baseball in Japan or Japanese baseball has to start with Shohei Ohtani. And not to be too personal, sound too personal, but my daughter lives in LA and the same age as Shohei Ohtani. So I have been secretly or not so secretly hoping that they would meet in somewhere in LA, and Shohei Ohtani would marry my daughter, and I will be his mother-in-law. But as you know, the last 2 weeks, this image has been circulated quite widely, right? This Shohei Ohtani is now spoken for. So you are now looking at this dejected, crestfallen Shohei Ohtani mother-in-law wannabe. So my dream did not come true, but life goes on. So anyway, talking about Japan, and Japan is a very big part of the global baseball, as Tom also mentioned. And look at this. Well, I'm sure that everybody knows who they are. Ichiro Suzuki on the left and Hideki Matsui on the right. So these are very familiar faces of Major League Baseball stardom. And I think it's not too much to say that maybe that baseball stopped being a national pastime, America's national pastime. But I think baseball is still Japan's national pastime. And the question is, then how did it become so? And Tom talked about the globalization in baseball and the baseball circulation and marketing. And what I'd like to talk about today is to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to give you a quick run through of the baseball exchange between Japan and the United States in the first 80 years of baseball play in Japan. So we are not really accustomed to think of Japan and the United States at this time as two trans-Pacific empires, but actually, United States and Japan made imperial debut only 3 years apart. In Japan's case, 1895, after beating Qin China and acquiring Taiwan, and then also the United States, of course, after the Spanish-American War and acquiring the Philippines in 1898. So it was only 3 years apart, and these intersecting trans-Pacific empires became a key fabric of the trans-Pacific world, and baseball's travel across the Pacific was a very important part of that braided, interconnected story. So where did it start? When did the baseball went to Japan? So this is Japan in the pre-war era. The Japan colonized Taiwan, and then 1910 Korea as well. So everything started in 1872, and with this guy, a young 28-year-old man, a Civil War veteran from Gorham, Maine, not exactly the hot spot of globalization in the 1870s, but he comes from very small a village in May, and he ended up in Japan in 1872. And he is the guy by the name of Horace Wilson. He was the one who introduced baseball to Japan, at least so the myth goes. And I think it is quite, it's not more than the myth. There is a historical record indicated that the first record of baseball in Japan was 1872. And he was actually a teacher hired by the Japanese imperial government, Meiji government, to teach math and English to a school that would later evolve and expanded into the present-day University of Tokyo. And he taught the students of this elite school in 1870s baseball, and the rest is history. For his contribution as the ambassador, inaugural ambassador of America's pastime to baseball to Japan, Horace Wilson was inducted into the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame in 2003. And then one of the reasons why baseball spread so quickly and far and wide in modern Japan was there were multiple channels, networks through which baseball traveled and then were shared. And also there were multiple agents, ambassadors of baseball involved. And as Tom talked about, actually Spalding was one of the ambassadors to the of the baseball to Japan as well. Spalding thought that Japan might be a very good overseas market, and then he corresponded with one of the first players of Japan, early players of Japan, and then Spalding equipment began to be marketed and sold in Japan as well. But it was quickly displaced by a domestic producer, Mizuno. So that was really Japan's earliest example of import substitution. Anyway, so there were so many agents of baseball involved in U.S.-Japanese relations. One was the U.S. expat communities in Japan as well. And this is a very interesting box score of the game played in 1896 between the Americans expats team based in Yokohama and the Tokyo Higher School. That is the school that would later evolve into the University of Tokyo. And as you can see, 1896, Japan 29, Americans 4. Japan beat the United States expat team 29-4, and it was a really huge deal in Japan. It was really it was reported across Japan, and it really the number of people, that's young students playing baseball, really skyrocketed after this first U.S.-Japan World Series, so to speak, 1896, and then that's one reason why that it really spread really quickly in Japan. Another sort of ambassadors of unlikely ambassadors of baseball in Japan was the U.S. Navy. Actually, U.S. Navy had a lot of ships, had baseball teams, and one was USS Olympia. This is Commodore Dewey's flagship. Some of you, the naval history buff, knows that this is the one that was a flagship in the Battle of Manila Bay in 1898, which started the Spanish-American War. So this one, the USS Olympia, it's a baseball team during its shore leaves in Yokohama, play baseball as well. And not to forget, Great White Fleet, Teddy Roosevelt Worldwide Naval Expedition in 1907-99, it made a stop in Yokohama as well. And Teddy Roosevelt's intent was to sort of intimidate Japan with all Japan, with the United States growing naval power in the Western Pacific. But that intent was to some extent defiant, because what happened while they were the fleet was anchored in the port of Yokohama is that their baseball teams played against the Japanese, and some of them really lost. So in terms of the U.S.-Japanese competition, as far as the baseball was concerned, it did not quite achieve Teddy Roosevelt's intent. Okay. And then also Japan's overseas migration started in 1884, and the Japanese Americans, the first generation Isseis, and then later on Niseis, they formed their baseball teams as well. And one of the first one is the Hawaii Asahi, 1905. This is the all Japanese baseball team in Hawaii. That was the first concentration of Japanese overseas migration. Hawaii Asahi was all Japanese team. And by the way, there were many Asahis amongst the Japanese American or Japanese North American diasporic community. Seattle Asahi, San Jose Asahi, Vancouver Asahi, Stockton Asahi, etc. So Asahi, those of you who speak Japanese knows that Asahi means the rising sun. So it's really interesting that Japanese diasporic nationalism was projected onto the name of the Japanese American baseball teams playing in Japan as well. Also, the college teams was a very important the agents of U.S.-Japanese economic the baseball exchange too. The Waseda University, this is one of the premier Japanese private university, made its first tour of the United States in 1905. And Waseda had established a system of a regular exchange with the University of Chicago after 1910. And after 1910, until the evil Pearl Harbor attack, these two elite universities, exchanged the teams, and they visited each other's countries every 5 years. So that's one of the primary examples of collegiate baseball exchange that really enriched this baseball experience running through U.S.-Japanese relations. And also, baseball was also a cultural footprint of two trans-Pacific empires. Some of the transportation networks that Tom also talked about in his talk, the passenger trans-Pacific steamship routes developed as the infrastructure of the two intersecting trans-Pacific empires, and places like Hawaii and Japan, Yokohama and Shanghai, and the Philippines, Manila, were the key nodes of this imperial transportation infrastructure. And this transportation network enabled Japanese baseball players of various sorts to tour Japan's colonial possession as well, such as Korea and Taiwan. And that explains why the baseball came to be played in Korea and Taiwan. And there are so many Korean players in the American Baseball Leagues as well. And Taiwan, the Chinese Taipei, is a key player in the World Baseball Classic. And this all goes back to the Japan's imperial roots as roots. Anyway, also talking about the Japanese Empire, in the 1930s, Japan even had a seasonal baseball circuit established in Manchuria as well. Manchurian League existed in the 1980s. Now, so using this kind of imperial infrastructure, then American professionals began to tour off-season to Japan as well. And as Tom talked about, 1919 tour was a really big one. But actually, what's noteworthy is this 1927 Negro League team, Philadelphia Royal Giants, visited Japan in 1927. And that was even 5 years earlier than the Major League Baseball, 1933 and 1934. Major League Baseball sent off-season tours in Japan to Japan's really rapturous welcome. This picture shows basically Ruth being treated as a hero. Hero. So this was 1933, 1934, and what's really interesting about this time frame is that this is exactly the time, 1930s, that U.S.-Japan diplomatic relations was quickly souring, really deteriorating. But there was a sort of parallel, separate track of U.S.-Japanese relations with a lot of cultural affinity. There was a lot of Japanese admiration for American popular culture at this time, like American Hollywood movies, and baseball was one of these elements of U.S.-Japan's shared love that was still holding the relationship together in the 1930s, despite the deteriorating diplomatic relations. But come the Pearl Harbor attack and World War II, the Japanese U.S.-Japan baseball exchange came to a screeching halt. But what's really interesting is the Japanese professional baseball continued to play until the 1944 season. That was really almost like it's 8 months before Japan's surrender. And so the Japanese baseball was hanging on by the thread, but then they continued through World War II. But when we talk about baseball and World War II, what I also want to point out is that the internment of Japanese Americans, because baseball was such an important element of the Japanese American community in North America and Hawaii, that a lot of the Japanese Americans intern and World War II internment camps, they formed leagues in the internment camps as well. And this is one of them, Manzanar, San Francisco Aces is Manzanar. So it's a really another poignant testimony to how integral baseball was to U.S.-Japanese relations. Now the war is over, but then United States occupation forces came, but the baseball came back really quickly in the U.S. occupied Japan after the war. The first professional baseball game that was played in occupied Japan was in November 1945. That was only 3 months after Japan's surrender. And that game was played with the blessing of the U.S. occupation forces. And April 1946, the 8-team Japanese Professional League resumed its play with the blessing of the American occupation forces. So to put it in a nutshell, only the Japanese professional baseball missed only one season in 1945. And you can easily guess why, that they were not really in a place to have a regular league play. And speaking of Japanese Americans, another interesting thing about the Japanese American community and baseball is that a lot of the Japanese professional players served during World War II and they died. And there was a serious talent depletion among Japanese professional baseball. And their solution to that talent depletion problem was import baseball talent workers from the United States. And many of them were Japanese American players. And the Japanese American players really allowed the Japanese professional baseball to keep going on in the early post-war years. And one of the most important one was this guy, Kaname Wally Yonamine. He was a running back for the formerly San Francisco 49ers, 1947, and then he was also playing baseball. And he was this guy is the first actually Japanese American pro football player as well. So this is Kaname Yonamine. Anyway, so I am going to finish up my talk pretty soon, but then I want to really end my talk with this by emphasizing that how important baseball was in U.S.-Japanese relations, and as such, the baseball was deployed for symbolic use in so many times. One time is that during occupation period, there was the first American professional tour to Japan was by this headed by this guy, Frank Lefty O'Donnell. He was a former Brooklyn Dodger, also New York Giants, playful New York Giants. And O'Donnell was also a member of the 1934 Babe Ruth tour of Japan as well. And he headed the AAA San Francisco Seals professional team to Japan during occupied Japan. And it was during this time, Seals tours, that the Japanese national flag, rising flag, was allowed to be hoisted before the game. And that was almost unheard of during American military, Allied military occupation, for the Japanese flag to be allowed to be hoisted. So that's one. Another thing is that this is another iconic picture, O'Donnell here too, and this is Joe DiMaggio. And this is the Shigeru Mizuhara, who was also a veteran of World War II. He was interned in Soviet labor camp at the end of World War II, and he returned and resumed his professional career. And this picture was taken on September the 2nd, 1951. Which happens to be the day that the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed, ending the American occupation. So the idea of this sort of iconic picture, photo opportunity, is that two veterans of World War II holding hands over the diamond, signifying the reconciliation of the two major previous rivals. And this is my favorite. This is O'Donnell, and this caption reads friendship or amity. And do you know who this guy is? He was the son of Emperor Hirohito, so the previous emperor, Akihito. And this picture, basically, the prince, he was at the time a crown prince, but he's shaking hands with Lefty O'Doul, and the caption saying friendship. This picture was circulated far and wide, basically impressing upon the Japanese public and whoever cares to pay attention to that now the new era in U.S.-Japanese friendship or alliance relations came back. So this is the way that the baseball was played a major role in U.S.-Japanese, and then also the history of the two intersecting Trans-Pacific empires as well. So I will end here, stop here, and hand over the baton or the bat to Dan Gilbert. Thank you for listening.
Hey, everybody. I'll start sharing my screen here.
Okay, how do I okay. Did I unshare it? No?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. All right.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, let's see.
Okay.
If there we go. Can you see so I'll turn off closed captioning. Can you see a image of a Pittsburgh Pirates facility? Okay, excellent. So thanks so much for the invitation to be part of this session. It's great to see Sayuri after many years and to connect with Tom and Mark for the first time. I really want to thank Paul and Kevin and everyone at the LePage Center. This is really an extraordinary thing that you all do, and I'm so pleased to get to be part of it. So my personal interest in baseball runs pretty deep. I played the game from a young age. I now find myself coaching my kids' Little League team. I'm a lifelong Red Sox fan, which means I've had a pretty good few decades here, something I'm trying to keep in mind as I'm reading all the season previews that have the Red Sox pegged to be a cellar dweller in 2024. But time will tell. We'll see how the season plays out. My academic interest in baseball has centered primarily on questions of labor. I started researching baseball's labor history because I got fascinated in this question of how in the kind of 1960s and 1970s, at a moment in American labor history when unions of most kinds of workers were really taking it on the chin and not doing all that well, this weird organization called the Major League Baseball Players Association, representing professional baseball players, managed to not only win union recognition, but totally transform their industry. In addition to the kind of union history of professional athletes as one dimension of baseball labor history that I'm interested in, I've also been interested in baseball's kind of connection to work and kind of working identity more broadly. So one kind of register of this is, you might think of some of the language that we use to talk about baseball, like describing something as a workmanlike performance or cheering somebody's kind of blue collar identity on the field. These seem to me kind of evidence of how baseball resonates with ideas and values that connect lots of other kinds of workers to the sport. So it's kind of from this point of view that I'll share a few thoughts this evening, and I'll try to speak quickly so we can get to your questions and our discussion. So I was asked to offer some thoughts about baseball's development in the Americas over baseball's kind of first century or so, and so I thought maybe I could make just three observations about this history. And the first one is that though clearly the role of the United States and of U.S.-based individuals and institutions, Spalding and others, was central. Actually, people and organizations from other countries played really pivotal roles in baseball's development as a popular sport across the hemisphere. I'll have more to say about that. The second thing I want to say just a bit about is industrial baseball. That is, baseball teams and leagues constituted by employees of industrial firms and other employers played a really important role in shaping baseball's development in the Americas. And then the third observation is simply that this history of industrial baseball or of company teams, the imprint of that remained in the sport's kind of subsequent development well into the late 20th century. For the sake of time and maybe for the sake of argument, I think it's instructive to focus on the Dominican Republic as a kind of central story in these themes. You heard earlier about the kind of 25+% of folks on major league rosters these days who are from other countries. The largest chunk of players in that group, the largest number of foreign-born players in Major League Baseball today and for the last number of years has been from this Caribbean nation, the Dominican Republic. Over 10% of Major League players today are from the DR. And so that seems to me as good a reason as any to zoom in on this place. Baseball has been a hugely popular sport in the Dominican Republic since the final decades of the 19th century. And the origins of Dominican baseball, interestingly enough, are not so much about the influence of baseball evangelists from the United States, but rather about the role of baseball players and baseball supporters, baseball fans from Cuba. The great historian Rob Ruck and others have highlighted the role of Cuban players as what they termed baseball's early apostles, spreading the game throughout much of Latin America. To kind of gloss this story, you could think of a kind of early generation of upper class Cuban young people who were sent to school in this country, in the United States, who learned the game here in the United States and then brought it home with them. And then in the later decades of the 19th century, Cubans, in a kind of remarkable piece of sport history, made baseball into a national sport in Cuba, kind of in distinction to and kind of defined in opposition to the Spanish cultural practice of bullfighting. The book On Becoming Cuban by Luis Perez is a great reference here. So amid a whole series of upheavals in Cuba in the late 19th century, in particular the 10 Years' War, the struggle for independence from Spain, a number of folks from Cuba departed to other places in the region. And so it was Cubans who ended up coming to the Dominican Republic, who helped kind of create Dominican baseball. And here the story of industrial teams or company teams, employer-sponsored teams, gets really interested. And it was indeed Cubans who end up kind of running much of the Dominican sugar industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, constructing the mills, the refineries that would turn San Pedro de Macorís, where you see a photograph on your screen, La Romana, other parts of the DR, into major sites of sugar production. And these Cubans who became part of the Dominican sugar industry brought their baseball obsession with them. The labor force for the sugar refineries included large numbers of workers recruited from elsewhere in the Caribbean as well, including from parts of the British Caribbean, where these workers had played another sport with a bat and a ball. They played cricket. And over succeeding years, many of these low-wage sugar workers who came from kind of cricket playing backgrounds would become tremendous baseball players, and their kids and grandkids have gone on to be some of the most impactful and famous Dominican baseball players. So these sugar mill owners, the folks, including these folks from Cuba who came to the Dominican Republic, like other industrialists from this period or in this period, saw sports programs as kind of a valuable means of both like drumming up publicity for their enterprises, but really creating kind of company-directed leisure and diversion for their workers and the broader communities of which they were part. And so it's part of this complicated history, at least in part, that baseball becomes a really widespread and popular sport in the Dominican Republic. The image that you're looking at is one that I took about, 15, 20 years ago, that is of the kind of later developments in this part of the Dominican Republic that grow out of this earlier history. And I'll say more about that in a minute here. But just a bit more about company teams and kind of the history of kind of industrial teams in baseball. Many of the folks in the webinar may be at least somewhat familiar with the story of Shoeless Joe Jackson, who is the gentleman standing second from the left in this image. Joe Jackson, who we associate with the Black Sox scandal of 1919, Field of Dreams, and everything else. Well, before Joe Jackson played for the White Sox, he played for multiple textile mill teams in and around Greenville, South Carolina, where he grew up. His dad was a mill hand, and Joe Jackson himself went to work sweeping the floor at a very young age. By 13, he was playing for the Brandon Mills team. Here in this picture from 1907, he is with other members of a nearby mill team, the Victor Mills team. Just one register of the kind of global phenomenon of industrial baseball. These are images from a kind of industrial sport history very close to where I live here in central Illinois, over in Decatur. The Staley Corn Processing Company hired former big leaguer Joe McGinnity to manage their company baseball team. And the Staley sports programs are kind of even more famous for their football program run by George Hallis, who was hired to be the sports director at the Staley Company. Part of this history of company teams being designed both to kind of market company products, but also to instill a kind of loyalty among the workers in the community. The Decatur Staley's football team were one of the founding teams of the National Football League, and it's actually a very interesting history of early professional football in this country. And the Decatur Staleys then will move after a year playing in Decatur, and they'll actually start playing their home games up at Wrigley Field in Chicago, and within a couple of years are the Chicago Bears. So there's an interesting imprint of industrial sports on football as well. There's the Decatur Staley's football team. Though many Dominican sugar mill teams were drawn from the regular workforce, as time went on, top players were specially recruited for their skills on the diamond. And along with sugar refineries, other Dominican businesses sponsored teams, including the Granada Company, which was the Dominican arm of United Fruit, and the first Dominican Hall of Famer, Juan Marichal, the great pitcher, famous for his work with the San Francisco Giants. One of his first professional gigs was pitching for the United Fruit team. But I'm jumping ahead a bit. Through the first half of the 20th century, Major League Baseball's color line divided the baseball world, right, and barred almost all Latin American players from playing in the majors and the affiliated minors. Excluded from so-called organized baseball in the United States, the most elite Dominican, Cuban, other Caribbean players competed in other circuits across the Americas, as well as in the North American Negro Leagues. And it would not really be until Juan Marichal's era, when large numbers of Dominicans would begin to be scouted and signed by U.S. major league clubs. But through the remarkable achievements of that first big cohort of Dominican stars in the integrated era, Marichal, the Alou brothers, Manny Mota, others, those achievements led major league teams to devote increasing attention and scouting resources to the Dominican Republic. And by the end of the 20th century, every single major league team was operating a facility like the one you see here on your screen, a recruiting academy. The baseball academy system has really become the single most important institution in Major League Baseball's relationship with the Dominican Republic, and one could argue with Latin America as a whole. So these recruiting academies where major league teams can sign and house and train, and ultimately bring from these institutions to the minor league system in the United States young Dominican players starting at the age of 16. These recruiting academies have been the kind of central institution in the creation of the Dominican Republic as that place where most foreign-born players are coming from. And so one of the things I find really fascinating about the kind of more recent development of this academy system, this new system of talent development that major league teams have developed in the Dominican Republic, is that the early infrastructure of the academy system itself was in some cases tied to that older history of company teams. So this picture that you're looking at, this field was actually a sugar mill field. So this is I don't know if you can see this on the Zoom screen or whatever, but so the picture on the lower left where you can see the baseball diamond in the background, that's taken from inside this sugar refinery in San Pedro. And that field used to be like the company field, and then the Pirates Academy eventually kind of took it over. And more recently, the Pirates have built a much kind of fancier and glitzier and kind of self-contained facility. But these images, I think, begin to suggest some of the ways in which that earlier history, where industrial baseball was kind of at the center, continue to shape in some ways Dominican baseball. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dan, Sayuri, and Tom. We have a question, which I'm going to toss out, and it's, I think, really directed at Sayuri.
Cool.
And that is, why did Japan become a country which was passionate about baseball when other countries around the world imported other global sports like soccer and cricket?
Well, I think it's very important that timing is really everything. I think when the Japan was industrializing and modernizing and have this creating this market for sports in the late 19th century, that's when the baseball came. And nothing else really was there. The baseball was really the only game in town. And this timing is once one big sport comes to a country and flood the zone and corner the market, it's very, very hard for other sports to displace that the first comer and then display create a competing market. So in Japan's case, at least, that it's the fact that it came first, and that coincided with the Japan's being industrialized and creating this kind of market, sports market. That was really the key. That's my understanding or my analysis of why this happened.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. I'd like to sort of circle back to this issue of the international draft and just get your opinion or speculation on what do you think will be the future of that? Well, are we likely to see something like that? And I guess we can ask Dan and maybe Tom if he has any views on that. You know.
Yeah, I think the international draft is such an interesting. It's been kind of on the table now for a number of years, and I found it a kind of fascinating little window into the players' union, the Major League Baseball Players Union, in the most recent round of bargaining with the owners. This is now 2 seasons ago. It was, if folks remember, it was a very contentious negotiation, and the season, we almost lost some games there. And it kind of came down to the owners really wanting the international draft and the players really wanting to get rid of this thing called the qualifying offer, which is basically a way of kind of constraining some of the free market power of free agents. So if you're about to become a free agent and the team that has held your contract gives you the qualifying offer, you can sign with them for an additional year at that price, which these days is like $20 million a year. If you don't sign the qualifying offer, you become a free agent, but the team that signs you then has to pay a draft pick back to the team that had you before. So it kind of makes you a kind of less desirable free agent. Anyway, so they kind of resolved the collective bargaining dispute. They got the season started again by they had this deal where the owners said, well, we'll get rid of the qualifying offer players if you agree to an international draft. And so it was up to the union to decide whether they would take that deal. And this was pretty clearly, at least from my point of view, an attempt by the team owners to try to divide the membership of the union, to pit like Latin American players who had come out against the idea of the international draft because it threatened to lower the amount of the signing bonuses for amateur players being signed out of places like the Dominican Republic, pitted those folks against other members of the union who would like to see the qualifying offer go away, and it seemed to threaten the possibility of a real kind of fracture of the union. And in a kind of remarkable moment of like solidarity, at least from the outside, the union rejected that, and they said, no, we'll keep the qualifying offer, so I think there's other dimensions of thinking about that, but
Mark, can I just jump in?
Yeah, sure.
And for the previous question too, I think Sayuri hit it right on the mark, just very briefly on. And of course, she's the expert on this, so I hesitate. But I think there's also a style of sports, perhaps appeal to Japan, a meticulous practice, like maybe Americans used to have. I think you had a race of empires across the Pacific, which she's written about. And of course, as she says, by the time this became dominant sport and in World War II hits, the United States is dominant in Japan. I mean, we're dominating that, until the peace treaty. So I think that's an aspect. For your question, the question about a draft, certainly Albert Spalding would have liked it. He would have certainly gone for that. And I got a feeling they're going to have it. Dan, it's absolutely, makes a lot of sense. But to expand rosters, perhaps, is how you buy off the union. And bring in these draftees. If there's money in it in professional sports, and especially baseball, that also, of course, is the only major sport that doesn't have a salary cap. We have the tax, but not the salary cap. That goes back in a long history of 100 or so years of union and management conflict. My guess is, though, with money in it, and if they can show they can recruit and bring in more players and more fans and more profit, there'll be a draft.
Thanks. Feel free to submit your questions if you're so inclined. In the meantime, I've got a question. Well, it's really a pet peeve disguised as a question. And I'm just wondering, does it seem like an anomaly in labor history that MLB owners' use of analytics has resulted in players getting paid more for doing less? And here I have in mind pitchers, right? I mean, I think, right, the history of sort of new technologies usually has led to a speed up, right, in labor, and maybe has been instituted to reduce the cost of labor. And this seems to be really out of whack with that history. So I'm just curious what your views are. And that I'll throw that open to anybody, but maybe we can start with the labor historian. I don't know.
That's a really interesting question. It seems to me that it's like I'm thinking about pitchers and analytics and changes we've seen in over the last number of years in baseball, that actually I think it's kind of in line with. I don't necessarily see this as anomalous. So I would say, going back to the kind of the beginning of scientific management and Frederick Winslow Taylor, analytics have been a key tool, as you say, in to drive down labor costs and indeed speed up and all that, by redesigning the work process. Throughout this history, right, we can think about examples of jobs that were traditionally performed by a single master craftsman being divided into smaller finite tasks that can be accomplished more cheaply by assigning those tasks to lower paid workers. And it seems to me that the transformation of pitching in the age of analytics is a kind of classic case of Taylorism, that while some starters continue to get big money long-term deals, and as you suggest, Mark, maybe are pitching fewer innings and yet still getting those top dollars, the trend, I think, is maybe just as much toward sort of younger, cheaper, more controllable arms getting kind of extended early on in their MLB careers, the kind of Spencer Striders of the world, getting a kind of larger contract at the beginning to kind of buy out a few of their first years of free agency. But actually teams getting more and more of their innings pitched by often younger or cheaper, or more controllable relievers who can rarely command multi-year contracts. So, like if you looked at all the innings pitched by a team like the Tampa Bay Rays, who've sort of been the leader in this over the years, I think they've kind of used analytics and other strategies to figure out ways of taking those innings away from pitchers they had to pay top dollar to and sort of distributing them among lower paid pitchers.
Okay, thanks. We have another question here, and this is, I guess anybody can jump in. Are there any countries or regions in the world where baseball was once popular, where it has faded or even disappeared? Tom alluded in his opening remarks to the, sort of downward trend as far as baseball's population was concerned in the 1970s, and but of course the game has revived, as he said. But are there any places where that didn't happen? Anybody think of any?
Can't think of any. I can think of places where it didn't take off as much as we thought. I believe it's Italy that's probably the biggest player in Europe, but it's never really taken off in the rest of Western Europe. I might be wrong. Spain for a while, it was big. So I think I can't think of Australia. From the World Tour, though not as big in New Zealand. Not that comes to mind though.
Anybody else? Well, I have a question about U.S.-Japan relations, noting that the Dodgers are opening up, and they're playing sort of an away game tomorrow at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in Seoul, Korea, and of course the star player is Shohei Ohtani.
Yes.
And this comes at a moment when I know the American government is encouraging warmer relations between Korea and Japan. So what has been this kind of the role of baseball in U.S.-Japan relations after the war? Can you give us just an overview of that, or?
A quick overview about the baseball and U.S.-Japan relations. Well, actually, since my talk was rambling on and I was going beyond my allotted time, so I cut off some of the parts, ending parts of my prepared talk. But so that's exactly what I was going to talk about. But so the Japanese, as I said, the Japanese professional baseball have to import talent, Japanese American players, and then also minor league players into Japan for a long time. But then Japanese players, the first Japanese major league leaguer was Masanori Murakami, which happened 1964. He only lasted one season. There were some contractual issue. Then after that, there wasn't the big hiatus of any Japanese player going over to the major leagues. And the next big one, really spike, came with a Hideo Nomo of the Nomo mania. He was a Dodgers 1985, and it was a very interesting case at the time that he really stiffed the Japanese professional baseball's reserved clause, basically using a loophole in their contract, and then the Japanese baseball, professional baseball, was such a cloistered, isolated business entity that it never occurred to them that their players might want to even go to the United States and work there, play there. So hence there was this big loophole. And when the Nomo had this contractual issue with the Nankai Hawks, and he said, basically, fuck you. Sorry for my French. And then he went to the Major League Baseball Dodgers, and the rest was history. And after that, he was really the pioneer of Japanese players basically going over to Major League Baseball and paved the way for people like Ichiro and then Matsui, and even my possible that the son-in-law that I never had, Shohei Ohtani. So, and then now that you have a interesting posting system, but there was a long time that the Japanese players were not even the presence in Major League Baseball, and then Nomo was the one that really paved the way for the rest of them. And now they have a very well established posting system through which many Japanese professional baseball players, top players, transfer to the Major League Baseball clubs. But talking also about the international draft, and I know that the Japanese professional baseball was really scared to death about the international draft. They were so afraid. They have their own draft system too. But if that happened, the Japanese professional baseball, they think that the Japanese professional baseball will be relegated into the farm team, minor league status of U.S. Major League Baseball, basically, and that kind of hierarchical restructuring of the global baseball industry might take place. So that I know that the Japanese organized baseball is really, really ambivalent about this international draft. So if
okay, all right,
could I add something to that too? And absolutely very logical. I always long thought of why baseball focused on Asia, and of course, as Dan says, on Latin America, the Caribbean, and Latin America, obviously carried not necessarily by U.S. Americans there, but to Asia and not Europe. And it's hard also to then ignore the fact that there was for good or bad, and depending on how you look at the history, the China market. And what Sayuri just said too, the international draft might lead to the collapse of Japanese baseball. But people I talk to in Major League Baseball are looking at China already. There are already well-developed academies, as Dan's saying. There are tens of thousands of kids, and it's a matter of time. So you could see China overwhelming the rest of the region just in pure population. The other mystery, of course, is India, which has a very developed bat and ball skill for kids in cricket already, right? And so MLB probably is looking at that as the next market too. The advantage the Japanese have, or Korean or Taiwanese also, it's so developed and at such a young age. I mean, we haven't had a chance to talk about Little League either, but how skilled those teams from those countries are too at the Little League level. It'll take a while probably for China and India, but that's probably all wrapped up in some way in the international draft question too.
Thanks. We have another question from the audience. I think this will be the last one. To what extent does the World Baseball Classic play a part in modern day globalization? And I'll tack a final question onto that. Are we ever going to see a true World Series, or is the World Baseball Classic pretty much going to be it? And by World Series, I guess I mean an American championship team against the Japanese championship team, and so on, playing Korean teams and the like. But I guess we should get to the first part of the question. To what extent has that World Baseball Classic played a part in modern day globalization?
Well, let me, obviously, perhaps directed at me first. Perhaps culmination of the Spalding Tour. The World Baseball Classic is obviously international and global on everything else. And Bud Selig, you could say, who was the commissioner at the time, certainly was as instrumental as an Albert Spalding in spreading the game. Whether we'll have a World Series, I don't know. It's very easy to say not in my lifetime. The thing I think that baseball, at least the baseball marketers, have going for them is this is an Americanized version, or an American brand, a U.S. American brand right now. And it always has been, and the stadiums are there and everything else. And it's still the goal to play to pitch at Yankee Stadium or hopefully, and if engagement follows with Sayuri's daughter at Dodger Stadium. But that is still, it's still marketed as, the American game. And that, I think that cultural thrust is very important there too. Whether you would have a World Series winner playing the Japanese winner, sure, I think that could be possible. But the World Baseball Classic, I think, was designed with that in mind. And the U.S. hasn't done great in that World Series. Won it once, but the Japanese have done great in that too. So.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Well, Dan, were you going to go?
Well, I'll say really briefly, one of the things that I love about the WBC is the way in which you can kind of glimpse other baseball cultures, like fan cultures, kind of in practice. It is this thing kind of moved by the commissioner's office in collaboration with the players union. But it, to the cheering cultures of Dominican fans and Japanese fans, and I think you can't come away from really watching that event without a sense for a kind of, a truly transnational or global identity for baseball beyond this country.
If I may say quickly, WBC and globalization, if it's any sign of a globalization, it's very interesting to see the composition of the Japanese championship this year, that there the 5 of them were Japanese, but actually they were major league American major league players playing for Japan. So it's when you talk about the Japanese national team, then it's a very interesting question. Another thing is that World Baseball Classic doesn't have to be a citizen, right? If you are one of your parents is held as a citizen of that country, then you can represent that country. It's very different from the Olympics, and that's the reason why that Lars Nootbaar, who is a St. Louis Cardinal outfielders, he's not even the Japanese. His mom is Japanese. And he was really the driving force behind the Japanese championship today, too. So when you think about this, what it means to have a national team, really, it's a very interesting question, and the interest ways in which the globalization of the talent and marriages and the basic globalization of demography is baked onto the World Baseball Classic as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience, and thanks for your questions. We appreciate you joining us this evening. And on behalf of the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest, we'll be signing off. Please keep an eye out for other programs sponsored by the center in the near future. All right, play ball. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.